The title of today's lesson is Knowing Your Place, and it's taken from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. So let's begin by just reading that passage. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. And they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels of their garments. And they love the place of honor at the banquets, and the chief seats in the synagogue, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called by men, Rabbi. But do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. God's law was given to the nation of Israel through Moses, and the Jewish people were to live by that law. At the time of the New Testament, there were basically three groups of Jewish leaders. And we read about them. They're mentioned. There are scribes, there are Pharisees, and there are also Sadducees. The scribes were actually the experts in the law. They are the ones that commanded the knowledge and actually did the teaching. In fact, many of the scribes established schools in which to teach and prepare the young men to know the law. They also did other things. They drafted legal documents. So they issued certificates of marriage, certificates of divorce, or sales type of agreements. The Pharisees, too, were legal experts. They adopted and believed strongly in the written law. And by that I mean the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses that were given. But they also accepted as authoritative or authority coming from oral traditions, from traditions that were established by their predecessors in terms of how the law should be observed and things that should be done. The Pharisees also believed in an afterlife. They believed in a resurrection that was to come, and they liked to make applications of the law to everyday events in life. So they were meticulous in trying to find ways that the law could be imposed on the things that people were supposed to be doing. The Sadducees were people who typically were more affluent. So whereas the Pharisees kind of had an association with the common man, the Sadducees were more associated with the rich, the powerful, and they were politically minded. They accepted the authority of the written law, the 5 books that Moses prepared in the Pentateuch, but they rejected the idea of oral traditions. They also did not believe in an afterlife or a resurrection. So as we start reading here in chapter 23, we see that Jesus is specifically talking to the multitudes and his disciples, and he's speaking about the scribes and Pharisees and how they're conducting themselves. And he notes that they are seated on the chair of Moses. And by that he's meaning the chair is symbolic of the Jewish legal authority that had been given to the teachers of the law. And so Jesus was acknowledging that that was their role. They were serving basically as judges, as interpreters of the law, and applying the principles of the law that had been given to the nation of Israel. But then Jesus comes forward with a criticism of them, and this is where we want to start. And it's in verse 3. He says, Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. So what Jesus did was issue a criticism that said, do as they say, not as they do. And then he proceeds within that criticism to point out 4 specific things, and we want to look at those to begin with. Let's see. So let's see. 4 in verse 3. For they say things and do not do them. So they were not practicing what they were preaching. And so his criticism to them initially is, they do not live it. And by that I mean they don't live up to the law. They say it, but they don't live it. It's not part of their life. They're not doing the things that they say. He goes on to say, and they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. They were placing greater burdens and expectations on the people than they themselves were willing to meet, right? So they were dumping all this stuff. You need to do, you need to do, you need to do. But they didn't do it, okay? And Jesus was highly critical of that. Let's read onward. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. So we see in that Jesus is saying, look, these people seek attention. They seek the attention of men. They want people to focus on them, okay, as they are special people. So this is a challenge to their motives. He's saying they don't have good motives. It's all about them. Now, the examples that he gives, they're basically dressing for show to draw attention to themselves. So what are these? So he mentioned the phylacteries. What is this and where does that come from? If we take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 18, if I can turn over to it. Starting in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 18, Moses wrote this, "You shall therefore impress these words of mine, on your heart, and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. And you shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So the idea here was that they were trying to emphasize the importance of the law, knowing the law, passing this information on. And so the idea of the phylacteries were the scriptures were to bind the law to your heart and mind. And what these literally were, they were little boxes that they put these passages, like the one I just read in, and they would take them in a band and strap them around their forehead and carry it before them. They would also often strap that around their arm so that they had the passages saying what they were to do in terms of remembering and binding the law. The tassels were attached to the 4 corners of their garments and were worn in their robes. And basically what these Pharisees were doing is they were making these lavish tassels to draw attention to themselves again. And it was the whole idea of drawing attention and focus on them as who they were rather than God's law and God's message. Let's read on. "And they loved the place of honor at the banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues." So they loved honor. And the honor they loved was not to God. It was not to the law. It was to themselves, right? They wanted the prestige of being these leaders seated on the chair of Moses, if you will. Let's read on. And respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called by men rabbi. So they also loved titles. They loved personal recognition. And specifically mentioned here was the idea of being called rabbi. Rabbi. That word rabbi literally means my master, great one. Okay? And it was a title that they assumed as teachers of the law. And Jesus said, not going to be any of that. And why did he say that? He said, but do not be called rabbi, okay? For one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. So after giving these criticisms of the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus then proceeds to give instruction to the people as to how this is supposed to be. And as you look at this list, do not live the things you teach. They seek attention. They loved honor. They loved titles. What is all this really aimed at in terms of the criticism and the things that were being done by the people? It was all aimed at their ego, right? It was being prideful. So they had a big ego. They had high self-esteem. They thought well of themselves. They were just controlled by pride. And so now Jesus turns right around and gives instruction as to how this should be. And this is what he says. Do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and all are brothers. So do not be called rabbi. Now, notice, be called. So he's making here a command, an instruction on individuals, on individual peoples. And so what he's saying here is do not elevate self. All right? Do not elevate self. Don't raise yourself up. Why is that the case? And here he makes the point, for, let's see, let me get to it. One is your teacher, and you are all brothers. This is a reinforcement of something that really comes from creation, from the way we're established. Because you recall, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created humankind in his own image. So he bestowed upon all human beings a body of flesh and blood, but a spirit. And so the hierarchy that God puts forth to humankind is there's God as the creator, and then there's everyone else, and we are all on the same level. Now, in the previous chapter, in Matthew 22, Jesus was confronted by a lawyer seeking to ask him, what is the greatest commandment of the law? And notice how Jesus answered that question. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. And what was the second one? The second one is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And who is your neighbor? It's any other human, right? It's all of us. So even in the greatest commandments, the first and the second, we see this model of what Jesus is putting forth, that God is preeminent and you are all equal. So you don't have a right to try and elevate yourself in any way above your fellow human being, okay? We are all on the same plane. So let's go on. Then he says, do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Now this is not talking about a parent, the one who who fathered you in terms of father and mother. He's talking here in the sense of using the term for superiority, for someone who is assuming authority or superiority to you. So this is the idea of do not elevate others. Okay? So the first one was this, don't elevate yourself. The second one is, no, don't elevate somebody else. Don't you elevate somebody else in terms of their importance or their priority. Okay? For there is one who is your Father. It's He who's in heaven. So again, pointing out to the fact that the one above you is God. Okay? He is the preeminent one. He's the one that's on top. And finally, in verse 10, do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, and that is Christ. That word there is being used as master, as guide, as one who assumes authority over you. Okay? So that one says, do not be called a leader. And the idea here is assuming a position of authority. And he's talking here about spiritual authority, about authority over your brothers and sisters, over other human beings. That authority does not rest with individuals, with people. That authority rests only with God, okay? And He's the one who is the source of that authority. He is one leader, and that's through Him, and we are to be followers. We are to be disciples, if you will, of Christ and the things that He has taught. Okay, that takes us now down to the principle, the underlying principle, which I called the lesson here. Let's look back to that. It's in verses 11 and 12, and it says the following, but the greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So let's note the lesson, the greatest shall be your servant. And that's the point. We see that this was actually modeled by Jesus in the washing of His disciples' feet in John chapter 13. He was the Son of God, and yet He humbled Himself to serve others. And that provides the example, the model in which we are to follow. And I'd like to point out, when we encounter teachings like this, these teachings are very much counter. They are opposite to what the world would teach, right? Worldly teaching would be, no, you need to elevate yourself. You need to get all that you can. You need to accomplish what you can and take it over other people, right? Get all you can get and take advantage of opportunities that you have to elevate yourself, right? That's an accomplishment in the eyes of the world, and that's what people look to. But Jesus says the opposite. Now, why does Jesus say the opposite? Why does He say you should serve others, you should humble yourself? The world view of this is based on the assumption that life is all there is, that your life ends at the grave, and so you need to get everything out of it that you possibly can. But God says that's not true. Your life on earth is just minimal. There is so much more beyond that, and that occurs in the afterlife, in what takes place when your body dies and your spirit is released to be with God. And so the advice that God is giving and the instruction that Jesus is giving is preparing us to be ready to have an afterlife with God in heaven. And if we want to do that, we need to not be elevating self. We need to be serving others and helping them. And that's the message he puts forth. It's very interesting. We turn very often to Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 5. And we go to that to talk about the nature of Jesus and who he was. And it begins by pointing out that we should have an attitude just like the attitude of Jesus Christ, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. And being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. There we see Jesus as the Son of God, and we see his humility in willing to offer himself as a sacrifice for all humanity. But very often we don't read the first 4 verses of that chapter. And I want to do that now. So let's go back and look at verses starting in verse 1. If therefore there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit with one purpose, intent on one purpose. And what is it? Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than yourself. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. So, in that pattern, we see exactly this idea of think of who you are. You are not God. You are a human being. God has created all of us. We're all in the same boat, if you'll permit me to say that. And we need to be working to help each other make it through this life so that we can all be in heaven with God. And that's exactly the principle here. Regard others as more important than you. No, lift them up when they're down. Don't just look out for your personal interests, but you need also to be looking out for the interests of others. And this was an attitude that the scribes and Pharisees missed. They lost sight of what the purpose really was. And that's important that we always remember it. So I close with one statement, and it's our title. May God help us to know our place.